On the early hours of a night the Iranian government has never officially confirmed, 9 women trained to kill simply vanished from a base that, to the outside world, did not exist. No trace, no body, no record. Their families never received a phone call. Their superiors never gave an explanation. And the most disturbing part of all, none of them appeared to have tried to escape. At least that's what the few people who know this program existed will tell you. What happened that night remains one of the most sealed gaps in Iranian military history. And what you're about to hear comes from accounts that took years to leak beyond Iran's borders. To understand what happened, you need to understand where this country stood at the time. We're talking about the early 2000s, a period when Iran was living under growing international pressure because of its nuclear program, economic sanctions that were strangling the population, and an internal tension the government was trying to contain with an iron fist. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had consolidated his power in near absolute fashion, following the turbulent years after Ayatollah Khomeini's death in 1989, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the most powerful military ideological body in the country, operated with an autonomy that even the elected president could not fully oversee. It was a state within a state, and within that state, there were layers that most Iranians never knew existed. One of those layers was an experimental female combat training program linked to the Revolutionary Guards, created not out of progressivism, but out of strategic necessity. The reasoning was cold and precise. Women passed through checkpoints more easily. Women could get close to targets in contexts where men would immediately raise suspicion. In a region where gender separation was rigid, and where an armed man could not search a woman without clerical authorization in certain public contexts, a female operative was an instrument the enemy did not expect. This was not about rights. It was about lethal efficiency. Recruits came from families considered politically reliable, generally daughters and sisters of martyrs from the Iran-Iraq War, that devastating conflict of the 1980s that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people depending on who you ask, and that left an entire generation of Iranians marked by a loyalty to the regime that was almost religious, because for many of them it actually was religious. These women were not recruited by force, at least not in the conventional sense. They were convinced that serving was an honor, that the sacrifice of their family members gave them both the right and the duty to defend what those people had died protecting, and they believed it. Training was conducted in separate facilities, far from the regular Revolutionary Guard bases, in locations that alternated between mountainous provinces in the northwest of the country near the Iraqi and Turkish borders, and underground complexes on the outskirts of Tehran that appeared on military maps with completely different listed functions: storage depots, communications substations, medical facilities. Anyone on the outside had no way of knowing what was happening inside. Inside, the recruits learned marksmanship, explosives, interrogation techniques, urban camouflage, and received an ideological formation that blended the Quran with guerrilla warfare manuals in a way that, according to accounts that reached researchers outside Iran years later, created a genuinely unsettling conviction in the operatives. Not brainwashing in the Hollywood sense, but because it made sense within the universe they had inhabited their entire lives. The group of 9 women who disappeared was part of a cohort that had completed the most advanced training cycle, which included long-duration covert operations. They had gone through simulated infiltration exercises in foreign countries, learned to operate under false identities in both Islamic and non-Islamic contexts, and at least 3 of them had functional fluency in Iraqi Arabic, Turkish, and basic English. This was not a group of beginners. It was exactly the kind of asset an intelligence service protects fiercely because it took years and considerable resources to build, which is what makes their disappearance so difficult to explain within any simple operational logic. The base where the disappearance occurred is described in documents that leaked decades later only as Advanced Training Facility, Restricted Zone, Province Unspecified. That vagueness is not an accident. It is standard in Revolutionary Guard files when it comes to operations that went wrong or that should never have existed on paper. What is known is that on the night in question, there was a reduced team of supervisors on duty. Access records were tampered with or destroyed, and when the morning shift arrived, the 9 women were not in their quarters, not on the training ground, not anywhere in the complex. Tracking dogs were used, UGs. They found nothing that made sense. What internal investigators from the Revolutionary Guards themselves documented in the days that followed, according to sources that took more than a decade to reach journalists and researchers outside the country, was a combination of absences that did not fit any clean narrative. There were no signs of jointly planned escape. There was no intercepted communication suggesting desertion. There was no evidence that an outside force had entered the facility. And there were no bodies, which eliminated the most sinister and convenient hypothesis that any authoritarian regime typically uses to shut down this kind of investigation before it gains internal traction. Iran in 2003 was not a country where disappearances were rare. In fact, it was almost the opposite. The crackdown on the reformist movement that had flourished under President Khatami was in full operation. Journalists vanished, students were arrested after protests, and reappeared weeks later in conditions that made silence the only reasonable response, and dissidents abroad were monitored with a persistence that Western intelligence services recognized as professional and systematic. The disappearance of people was, in many contexts, a tool of the state. But the disappearance of highly trained operatives from inside a facility controlled by the Revolutionary Guards themselves was something else entirely. It was a problem the regime needed to solve quietly and fast, before the existence of the program itself leaked out. Iranian military culture of the time had a particular relationship with the question of women that is important to understand without falling into oversimplification. The Islamic Republic of Iran had built since 1979 a narrative in which the revolutionary woman was a central figure, but within very specific parameters. The mother of the martyr, the wife of the combatant, the nurse in the battlefields of the war with Iraq. There were female militias, female besiege organizations, and a social control apparatus that used women to monitor other women in spaces that men could not access. But a combat operative trained for covert missions abroad was a figure that did not exist in the public narrative, and could not exist, because her existence would contradict the very ideological foundations with which the regime justified the separation of roles between men and women. It was a secret that needed to remain secret not only for operational security reasons, but for ideological coherence reasons. And when the 9 disappeared, the regime faced a double problem: find them without admitting they ever existed. The accounts that reached researchers abroad, compiled over years by organizations such as the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, and by journalists working with sources inside the Iranian diaspora, indicate that the internal investigation was conducted by a special unit of the Revolutionary Guards, separate from the regular intelligence structure, with direct authorization from the upper echelons to operate outside any normal institutional oversight. That alone says something. When you pull an investigation out of regular channels and place it in hands that answer directly to the top, it is generally because what you are investigating cannot leave a trace within the system you control. The investigation lasted at least 6 months, possibly longer. And what it concluded, if it concluded anything, has never come to light in any verifiable form. What leaked, in fragments, over years, were pieces that need to be treated with the honesty the subject deserves. They are second and third-hand accounts, memories of people who knew people who were close to the event, documents whose copies circulate in formats that make authentic verification genuinely difficult. With that caveat placed on the table, the fragments point in several directions that repeat with enough consistency to deserve attention. The first is that at least part of the group may have been exfiltrated by a foreign operation, and the name that appears most frequently, though without direct proof, is the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, which was operating with growing aggression against Iranian targets during that period. The second is that the disappearance was internal, an elimination operation conducted by the Revolutionary Guards themselves against a group that had discovered or witnessed something that made their continued existence inconvenient. The third, which some researchers consider the most likely precisely because it is the least dramatic, is that the group executed a collectively planned defection with a sophistication that the very training they received made possible, and that they succeeded in getting out because they knew exactly how the system that contained them worked. The daily life of these women inside the program, in the years preceding the disappearance, is described in available accounts as an existence of near-total isolation, interspersed with periods of operational intensity that left little room for anything resembling a personal life. Contact with family was controlled, correspondence was monitored, group cohesion was simultaneously encouraged as a tactical virtue and watched as a possible vector of conspiracy. because supervisors knew that women who developed very strong bonds among themselves could create loyalties that competed with loyalty to the program. That tension between building a unit cohesive enough to operate with efficiency and preventing that cohesion from turning against the controllers was a problem that similar programs in other countries also faced, and rarely resolved in any satisfying way. The geopolitical context of that specific moment added layers of pressure that should not be ignored. In 2003, the American invasion of Iraq had placed U.S. forces on Iran's western border. The Bush administration had included Iran in what it called the axis of evil 2 years earlier. Iranian nuclear programs were under increasing scrutiny from the UN's Atomic Energy Agency. And inside Iran, there was real tension between factions of the Revolutionary Guards who wanted escalation and factions that preferred strategic containment. A program of female operatives for external missions was sitting at the exact center of those tensions, because it represented an offensive bet at a moment when part of the military establishment preferred a defensive posture. The 9 women, without knowing it, or perhaps knowing it very well, were pieces in a game that had far more layers than their training had ever revealed to them. What no account of this episode can ignore is what it says about the position of women inside power structures that use their capability and then erase their existence when it becomes inconvenient. That is not an ideological observation. It is a structural one. The program existed because women were useful in a way men were not. It disappeared from the records because admitting its existence created problems the regime did not want to face. And the 9 women who vanished that night were erased twice. First from the base, then from official history, in a country where the identities of intelligence operatives were protected with extreme rigor. The erasure did not even generate a visible gap in public documents, because these women had never publicly existed to begin with. Iranian culture at the time had specific ways of dealing with the disappearance of sons and daughters the state had taken for itself. Families of martyrs from the war with Iraq had developed throughout the 1980s a language of grief that was simultaneously genuine and politically shaped. The dead son was celebrated, the sacrifice was honored, the pain was sublimated into a narrative of glory. But for families of people who simply vanished without an official martyrdom narrative, the process was completely different and incomparably more cruel, because there was no social structure through which to process that loss. There was no ceremony, no martyrdom certificate, no pension, nothing that acknowledged the person had existed and been taken. Only silence and the unspoken understanding that asking out loud what had happened created risks for the rest of the family. The families of the 9 women, according to what the accounts allow us to piece together, were given varying versions of the same non-explanation: transfer to a classified mission, need for silence due to national security requirements, promises of future contact that never materialized. Some families waited years before attempting any kind of inquiry, and when they did, they found walls that did not even take the form of a negative answer. There was simply nothing. No official to speak with, no record to consult, no address to send a letter to. The program did not exist. Therefore, the women did not exist. Therefore, their disappearance did not exist either. It is a form of erasure that goes beyond conventional authoritarianism and enters into something that can only be described as the administrative eradication of reality. Researchers working with the intelligence history of the Middle East point to parallels with similar situations in other countries of the region. Cases in Syria, in pre-invasion Iraq, in Egypt, where experimental intelligence programs were shut down in ways that ensured participants could not tell what they knew. The way those shutdowns happened varied, but the result was usually the same. No records, no verifiable testimony, no accountability. The difference in the Iranian case is that fragments kept leaking over decades, preserved in the memories of people who left the country in subsequent waves of emigration, and who, once safe abroad, began to talk. Not in a coordinated way, not dramatically, in pieces, in conversations, in interviews conducted for human rights documentation purposes, in testimonies given to university researchers working with intelligence archives from the period. What those fragments allow us to say with some degree of confidence is that the program existed, that it was advanced enough to invest years of training in a select group of operatives, and that something happened that night which the regime never wanted to explain. What they do not allow us to say, with intellectual honesty, is exactly what that something was. The 3 hypotheses, foreign exfiltration, internal elimination, planned defection, all remain open, and they may remain that way. Archives that the Iranian government does not want opened are not usually opened by the passage of time alone. They open when regimes fall, when dissident officials decide they have nothing left to lose, or when foreign intelligence services decide that revealing what they know serves their interests at the right moment. What this episode leaves behind is a question that goes beyond Iran and beyond the 2000s, which is the question of what happens to people a state trains to serve its most secret purposes and then does not know how, or does not want, to reintegrate into the official narrative. It is not a question with a simple answer, and this channel is not here to pretend otherwise. But it is a question worth asking, repeatedly, out loud, for audiences who have the luxury of asking it without consequences, because it is precisely that luxury that creates the responsibility not to let these cases disappear, along with the people they involved. If you made it this far, there is a reason for that. Stories like this one do not let go easily, and that says something about the kind of person you are. So before I ask you to do anything else, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever known someone who just disappeared into a system, and the silence around it was treated as a sufficient answer? A family member? Someone from your town? A case you followed from somewhere in the world where the official version never quite added up? Write it in the comments. It does not have to be long. It does not have to have a resolution. Sometimes the act of naming what happened is itself a refusal to let the erasure be complete. This community reads those comments. These stories matter here. And if this channel is not yet part of what you watch regularly, and today change that even a little, subscribe. Not because every channel asks you to, but because what gets built here, week after week, is a space for the kind of history that does not make it into the comfortable versions. The stories that were meant to stay buried. You will want to be here when the next one surfaces. We will not wait long.